So today, I'm going to do some things that we really haven't done before, and I think you'll see here how this is kind of a reversal of a lot of the things that we've talked about. So remember, as we're looking at the American colonial experience, it is, as we've talked about, a deeply, deeply Protestant experience. And so in almost every way, these colonists and those people of the American Revolution are still very much living in the Reformation. So as J.C.D. Clark, scholar that I've mentioned to you before, as he says, the War of the Revolution is really the last battle of the Reformation. And I think that's accurate when we think about all the various peoples who settled, not the Africans, of course, but the free English who come and settle in the North American colonies. They are a deeply Protestant people. As Edmund Burke said, they are the most Protestant of Protestants. And hardly any of them have ever actually met a Roman Catholic. A Roman Catholic in their mind is exactly the opposite of what they are. They believe that they're enlightened, they believe that they're progressive, and when they look at the Roman Catholics, they see regress, and they see superstition, and they see idolatry. So they've made this boogeyman out of Catholicism that historically and theologically is just not accurate at all. But that's been our story now for 8 weeks that we've been looking at these peoples. So I want to give the other side of it today, and I want to look at the only Catholic signer of the Declaration, Charles Carroll of Carrolton. And I want to get into his life. I think he's a really fascinating figure, and he helps us balance out a lot of what we know in terms of the American founding. So here, I'll get his name down, Charles Carroll of Carrolton. So notice he gives himself a noble title, and I'll try and explain why here in a moment. Born in 1737, doesn't die, amazingly enough, until November 14th of 1832. He is 95 when he dies, and he is the last signer of the Declaration of Independence to survive. And if you've ever seen that terrible movie, National Treasure, at the beginning of it, Charles Carroll is this Freemason who gives all the information away, and then the whole story proceeds from there. Believe me, Charles Carroll was not a Freemason in any way, shape, or form. That would have been completely illegal from his Catholicism. But I'm joking, that movie's, I mean, who's the main actor in that? Nicolas Cage, right? It's one of our finest actors, right? So, just amazing. But anyway, so that, if you guys know Charles Carroll, he shows up at the very beginning of that movie, at least in a Hollywood representation. Okay, so what do we know? And what's our background here? One of the worst mythologies that is taught to American school children is that all of the colonists came over seeking religious freedom. Right? We hear that all the time in our textbooks for our kids. And there are always things like, well, the Anglicans go to Virginia, and the Puritans go to New England, and the Catholics go to Maryland. And that's just barely a part of the story. What we really know, and I'm going to put this in kind of cheesy terms, but what we really know is that North America could be compared to a kind of sea of tolerance in which there are thousands of islands of intolerance. Nobody comes to America for religious freedom. They all come to protect their own religion from everybody else. So what they want is religious autonomy. They don't want religious freedom. So the Puritans, when they settle in New England, are in no way going to let the Anglicans do anything in their community, or the Baptists. And the Catholics are hated in the American colonies, but nobody's more hated than the Baptists. The Baptists are absolutely out in all the colonies except Rhode Island. So they are always seen as the worst of the Protestants, and the other Protestants don't respect them at all. So they're widely persecuted everywhere. When the Anglicans go to Virginia, they do not allow anybody else except the Anglicans to perform their services in Virginia, and they actually tax everybody for their churches. So there's no sense at all that anybody's coming over for religious freedom. The only real exception to that are the Quakers, and even they are not completely tolerant. They're more tolerant in Pennsylvania than they are elsewhere, but they're still not that tolerant. So again, what we find then is that when people come over from Europe, they seek out one intolerance as opposed to another intolerance. So that's why, again, I know this is cheesy, but you can really think of it as this kind of ocean of tolerance with islands of intolerance, and you get to choose which one that you live in. But let's take the second myth then. If the first myth is that they came over for religious freedom, the second myth is that all these different religions within Christianity, not Judaism, but within Christianity, they all get their own colonies. And so we always identify Maryland as the Catholic colony. And even the very name, Maryland, right, sounds very much like it's named by a Catholic, for Catholics. Well, here's what really happens. There is this guy named Lord Calvert, who is a Roman Catholic in Britain. He's an elite. And one of the things that we often forget is that during the Reformation in England, so when Henry VIII has passed through Parliament the Act of Supremacy, and Henry is 1534, and Henry becomes the head of the Church of England. What we often forget is that there is a huge divide within England between those who want to be more Calvinistic and those who want to be more Catholic within the Anglican Church. There's a great divide. And remember, almost the country was a Catholic country. So all of Henry's friends convert to Anglicanism, and all the poor and the middle class convert to Anglicanism. But there's a whole number of aristocrats that refuse to convert, and they go underground. It's illegal to be Catholic, but they do it anyway. And so what they do, and so you see these, if any of you have read, for example, Brideshead Revisited. It deals with these old Catholic families that have been secret for hundreds of years. And they had bolt holes in their castles, and they would always have these hidden rooms where they could say Mass, and they would get one Jesuit from one estate to another. And so this was all a part of English culture. Well, what that means is you have someone like Calvert, Lord Baltimore, who is still one of these old aristocrats. And so for England to deal with him, the best thing they could do is get all the Catholics out of England and send them to Maryland. So the Crown sets up the colony of Maryland, really as a private corporation under Lord Baltimore. And so they set this up, and they allow these Catholics, almost all of them elite Catholics. You don't have poor Catholics in England at this point, because they would have all converted to Anglicanism. But you have these elite families that then move to Maryland. But here's the problem. I'll give you two problems that go along with this. Number one, when those Catholic families come, and remember, they're wealthy families, they bring their estates with them. That is, they bring all of their people with them. So everybody who'd been on their old estate in England moves to Maryland as a part of the family. But almost every one of those extended family members is Protestant. So you actually, even though you have a number of Catholics who migrate, they're outnumbered about 10-1 by their Protestant servants who are coming with them. So again, even though we call it a Catholic colony, it's really not that Catholic in terms of population. But I also, and this is the second thing I want to do here, I want to read to you what Lord Baltimore's instructions are to the Catholics who come over to North America. So this is dated 1633, and this is his instruction. And he starts off, imprimis, right, just like our journal, but be cognizant, imprimis. His lordship requires his said governor and commissioners that in their voyage to Maryland, not Maryland yet, but Maryland, they be very careful to preserve unity and peace amongst all the passengers on shipboard, and that they suffer no scandal nor offense to be given to any Protestant, whereby any just complaint may hereafter be made by them in Virginia or in England, And for that end, they cause all acts of the Roman Catholic religion to be done as privately as possible, and that they instruct all the Roman Catholics to be silent upon all of their theology and their discourse concerning matters of religion, and that the said governor and commissioners treat the Protestants with as much mildness and favor as justice will permit, and this is to be observed at land as well as on sea. So notice what his instructions are. You can be Catholic, but you better be silent about it. And so from the very beginning, Catholics are seen, even in Maryland, as basically second-class citizens, even though they have that elite status in terms of socioeconomics. So from the very beginning, they're meant to be quiet. And so again, Maryland is not this Catholic colony that our grade school taught us it was. It's something else. But here's what's really fascinating. And I've done some good, well, I won't say it's good. I'll say I've done some academic work on this, and I hope it's good, what I've done. But I've been very interested in what happens in Maryland, because Maryland actually passes a law in 1649. So remember, they get there in 1633. So in 1649, and then again in 1654, they pass an act of absolute toleration for all religions. And as far as I know, and again, I've tried to do good work on this, I have never been able to find anywhere in the history of the world prior to this an act as liberal as what, in the best sense of what this is and what's going on in terms of toleration. And if you read the toleration laws, they basically include Jews and Muslims that could be acceptable. Now, you still have to be religious, but you can't be an atheist and be a citizen of Maryland. But you don't have to be a Christian and be a citizen of Maryland either. This is how open this act of toleration is. But here's what they do. And I think that for most of us at Hillsdale, we're going to be a little offended by this. But what they try to do is they trade off religious freedom for freedom of speech. They don't believe that they can have both freedom of speech and freedom of religion at the same time. So there's absolute toleration on religion, again, as long as you believe. You can't be an atheist. And that, don't be shocked by that. Nobody in the 1700s or the 1600s would have allowed an atheist anywhere near government or court because they're not trustworthy at all. Kendall.
Just out of curiosity, would like deism be like allowed, like Ben Franklin kind of style?
Franklin is because he's Franklin,
okay.
Right? But it's still not acceptable within
really?
society. But there are three deists at the time of the founding: Jefferson, Benjamin Rush, and Ben Franklin. And they're such good scientists that it's acceptable, but it's not totally acceptable. So there's still things that they would be excluded from in society for being that way. And it's interesting if you look, I'm sorry.
Even in Maryland?
Yeah, I'll get to that in a second. Everything's going to change in Maryland, so don't get too hyper about this yet. You never can have atheism. And even when James Madison passes what's called the Remonstrance in Virginia, which allows some religious freedom, it absolutely does not allow an atheist to have any public role in the state at all. None.
Are deists considered atheists?
Well, it's a great question,
atheists?
Kendall. It's not quite atheism because it still believes in God, but it's a pretty malleable God. It's not one and again, guys, remember, these people are deadly serious about their religion, right? In ways even we at Hillsdale couldn't recognize. It's just everything for them to be religious, right? And specifically to be Protestant, right? So everything that goes along with that is really important. Liam?
Were there atheists?
Sure.
Were atheists in the colonies?
Not in the colony. I mean, if they were quiet about it. The most famous atheist of the day was David Hume in Scotland. And he also was shunned by a lot of people because of that. But again, he's David Hume. He's the great philosopher, so he could get away with it. And that again, that's the same in America. You do have these prominent deists who are quasi-atheists, But we'll see this too when we get into the 1790s. Atheism becomes a fad, especially among people your age. It becomes a huge fad among college-age students. And it's why the Second Great Awakening happens. It's in response to the rising atheism of the time. So, yeah.
Were there Muslims and Jews?
They're Jews, but there are no Muslims. No, not at all. Not a single one. But there are several Jewish, especially in Rhode Island. There's a large Jewish colony there in Providence. But not, and a few will come to the south to Charleston, but it's mostly Rhode Island at this point. Judaism won't really come to America until about the 1880s and 1890s. And for a while, New York had far more Jews than Israel did. And everybody thought the new Zion would be New York City rather than Jerusalem. So that in the 1890s, that was the thought anyway. But yeah, so thank you for that. Okay, yeah, please.
Yeah, sorry.
No, you're fine.
This was just about what you said about trading off religious freedom for freedom of speech. Does
Yeah.
that mean that they thought they couldn't have freedom of speech without
Yeah, I'll get to that. Let me get to that. So here's what they do, and here's how they make the trade-off for religious freedom and for freedom of speech. They basically make a number of things illegal to say publicly. So the first thing, and there are three things in particular you simply cannot say in Maryland without being imprisoned for it. So number one, you can never blaspheme against God at all. You can't make fun of him, you can't make jokes about him, nothing. Everything that you say about God has to be deadly serious and purposeful. So there are all kinds of blasphemy laws that are put into effect. Really the kinds of things that we would see in Muslim countries today. So this is pretty radical for Maryland to be doing this. Number two, and I always find this somewhat humorous, and this is where you can see the Catholicism coming in just a little bit. But number two, you cannot make fun of the Virgin Mary or of any of the 12 apostles. So that you can't say anything derogatory about Mary or the 12 apostles. And number three, and I'm going to read this to you because I find this hilarious, and it tells us something different about the time. You can never label a person by their religion. You can't openly label them. So, upon any manner or offense, otherwise in a reproachful manner or way, you may never declare, call, or denominate any person or persons whatsoever inhabiting, residing, trafficking, trading, or commercing. So notice what they're saying there. Even people who aren't residents of Maryland but are traveling through, you may not in any way label their religion. This is true for every port, harbor, creek, and haven. Therefore, you may not call anyone a heretic, a schismatic, an idolater, a Puritan, a Presbyterian, an independent, a popish priest, a Jesuit popish priest, a Jesuit papist, a Lutheran, a Calvinist, an Anabaptist, a Brownist, an Antinomianist, a Barrowist, a Roundhead, a Separatist, or any other name that is meant in a reproachful way. So we today have no problem calling Lutherans Lutheran, right? And we have no problem calling Mormons Mormon, though Mormons don't like that at all. They want to be LDS. But it's something that we've gotten used to. But obviously at the time, this was considered language that creates separation rather than unity. So to denominate somebody means that you're separating them from the larger body of religious believers in one way or another. But notice what they do, and I think, again, I think at a place like Hillsdale, we can be rather offended by this, and that is that they are trading off freedom of religion or freedom of speech for freedom of religion. And they don't realize yet, and I think this is what's so important about the American founding, one of the things that's so important about the American founding. We're going to have almost, not quite, but we're going to have almost complete religious toleration by the time we get to 1776. And certainly all varieties of Christians will be accepted. Jews will be accepted, mostly because of George Washington, and his personal example of that. But we'll see that as something radically changing. So that, if you guys remember, you would have had this in American Heritage, that when you look at the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, its first statement is that there shall always be religious toleration in the said territory, as long as that religion doesn't harm another person. You can be whatever you want. You can even be an atheist. And so that's radical to change that. And I think that's really the brilliance of the founding, is that it can balance both freedom of religion and freedom of speech at the same time. Well, there's a fourth thing for these laws in Maryland. And the fourth thing is, you are not allowed to say a cuss word on Sunday. You can be imprisoned for that as well. So Sundays have to be free of foul language, which was not atypical in the colonies. Remember, as we talked about, especially the farther north you go, the cleaner the language will be the farther north that you go. All right, well, here's what happens. So Maryland has this law that, as far as I know, is the most tolerant law anywhere in the world as of 1649 and 1654. And they prosper under it. Maryland, if you've ever been to a place like Annapolis, it's a beautiful, beautiful city. It was one of the great colonial cities, very wealthy, one of the wealthiest cities in North America. It was a great trading province. And so what happens then, you have, crazily enough, this coup in 1688, and it's done in the name of the Glorious Revolution. Remember, 1688 in England is when William and Mary come in, invited by Parliament, and they displace James II. And so the king and his men are run out of England, and William and Mary come in. And remember what had been the problem. James was married to a Roman Catholic, and they had a son, and that meant that that son would have been raised Roman Catholic and would have been next in line for the throne. And you can't do that in England. That's totally illegal. So they run James out, and they bring William and Mary in. Well, in Maryland, remember the Protestants, the Anglicans far outnumber the Catholics, probably a good 20 or 30 to 1 overall. In fact, it's even more than that, because by the time we get to the American Revolution, only 8% of Maryland's population is Catholic. It's 92% Protestant. So they greatly outnumber the Catholics at that point. So in 1688 and 1689, the Protestants have a coup. And not only do they take over the government in Maryland, and I hope you guys realize this is rare. We don't see this happen very often. In fact, the only other example I can think of, Montana has a coup in the 1870s. Right? There's a huge fight in Montana between the old miners who have control of the government and then the ranchers who come in. And still to this day, if you get pulled over by the Montana State Police, their badges say 7777, which was the secret code of the coup, and that they're able to take over in 1877. But as far as I know, these are the only 2 times this happens in American history. So these guys take over in Maryland, and what do? They not only completely abolish the Toleration Acts of 49 and 54, but they make it completely illegal to be a Roman Catholic within Maryland. And so that's going to be the case from 1688 all the way up until 1774. And I'll give you some examples of what this means. You can't be a Roman Catholic in England either. It's not legal to be a Roman Catholic until 1832, when the reform laws are passed. It's illegal. And what they share in common is this: no person who is Catholic can ever serve in a court of law or serve in politics or have a vote. So they're completely disenfranchised, and they can't appear in a court of law. But they take it even farther than that, And what they say is that any Catholic who owns property will be double taxed compared to all other persons. So you can imagine what this means, and this is going to get interesting here in a moment. But they take this yet even further, and the way they define this, if I ever try to raise my child in a Catholic fashion, that child will be taken away from me, sent to England, permanently to be raised by a Protestant family. So it is utterly illegal to raise your children in Maryland as Roman Catholics. You lose everything. They closed all the churches down in Maryland. So everything is closed. So again, this is where when people say Maryland was our Catholic colony, no, it wasn't at all in any way, shape, or form after 1688. So for 100 years, it is it's the most anti-Catholic colony in America. Liam?
Did they just think that Catholics didn't have the same rights as them? Because it kind of feels hypocritical.
Yeah, the argument is this. The argument is that Catholics worship a foreign leader because they have the Pope and therefore can't be loyal citizens. So remember when we talked about the Commonwealth men, they said that anyone could be religious, but only well-behaved Catholics could have rights. So that's what they mean by that. They mean a Catholic who doesn't accept the Pope as a leader. So that's going to be the argument here. Okay, so these are really draconian laws that are being passed. But this is what happens that's absolutely fascinating. Because Catholics are not part of the legal system, they're also not regulated by the same economic rules that Protestants are. It's a loophole. It's exactly the same thing that happened with Jews in the Middle Ages. And one of the reasons that Jews went into banking and property and gold and mining because they're left alone, because the laws don't apply to them. You know, the laws apply to the Christians, but they don't apply to the Jews. And the same thing happens here in Maryland, where the economic laws don't apply to the Catholics in the same way they apply to the Protestants in Maryland. And what that means is that the Catholics can go into banking because they're not restricted by usury laws. They can also go into property ownership. And the great irony of all of this is that the Catholics who were already very wealthy become even wealthier in Maryland, despite being double taxed and not being able to go into court. So despite all of that, and this guy right here, Charles Carroll of Carrolton, he is the third Carroll in his family in Maryland. So his grandfather is called Charles Carroll the lawyer. His dad is Charles Carroll of Annapolis, and he is Charles Carroll of Carrollton. And by the time he inherits his father's fortune, they are unquestionably the wealthiest citizens in all of North America. No one even comes close to the Carrolls. And what they do that's so brilliant is they loan money to everybody, and therefore everybody owes them something. And so George Washington invests all of his money with the Carrolls. Thomas Jefferson invests his money with the Carrolls because, again, they're not restricted economically in the way that the Protestants are. And so it creates this situation in which they can have this immense wealth. And so they come out of this. But here is Charles Carroll, and I want to talk about him for a bit because of why I think he's so important for us here in this class. So Charles Carroll was born in 1737. He is born to Charles Carroll of Annapolis and his mother, who can't get married to the father because it's illegal to have a Catholic wedding. And so they live together in sin with one another because it's not legal for them to get married. And so they are essentially, for all intents and purposes, a man and a woman living together. Therefore, they're under common law, but they're not under any other legal obligation. And they have their son in this marriage, such as it is. They have their son Charles. But remember, it's illegal, totally illegal, to raise your child in a Catholic fashion. So what they do is they wait till he's 11. And at age 11, though they've been tutoring him and working with him, and he's a genius, there's no question about this, he's brilliant. He and his best friend, who's his cousin, John Carroll, who will be the first archbishop in America, John and Charles, they call themselves Chuck and Jackie, they go to France. And they stay in France for 17 years. It's amazing. At age 11, they go. And they live in France. And of course, the father can afford it. He can pay for both of these kids. Yeah, he's got all the money in the world. And so these kids, Jackie and Chuck, they go to a school, very famous, and my French is absolutely terrible, so please forgive me, and even when I try my best, I still have a Kansas accent with my French. Saint-Omer is this place that they go. It is on the very northern tip of France, right across from England. It is a Jesuit college, and its motto is to convert England to Catholicism. That's its motto. This is a radical, radical place. This is the most radical Jesuit place anywhere in the world, the most radical Jesuit institution. And so Charles and John go to school here. And it's college. This is all based on two really important things, the education. First of all, it's utterly classical. It is illegal at this school, by the school rules, to speak anything other than Greek or Latin. Doesn't matter if you're in your dorm room or if you're in the cafeteria, wherever you are, you can only speak Greek and Latin. Otherwise, you're punished for speaking any other language. So everything is Plato and it's Aristotle, all the way up to Aquinas. And then, and this is where it gets, I think, really interesting, there are three really prominent Jesuits at the time of the Counter-Reformation. And I want you guys to know them, or at least know their names. The most important by far is an Italian, though we anglicize his name, by the name of Robert Bellarmine. He's the most prominent of these Jesuits. But there's also Francisco Suarez, and there's Juan de Mariana. All three Jesuits. They're going to be really important for us, and here's why. These Jesuits take Thomas Aquinas' argument. You guys remember from your Western Heritage class, you all had to read on kingship. You guys remember that from Western Heritage? So that's the definitive statement by the medieval church about what rulership is. And if you remember on kingship, what it says is that the only king who is legitimate, right, the only king who is legitimate, is one who completely sacrifices himself for his people. If he ever, in any way, shape, or form, acts in a way that's to his private interest rather than to the commonweal, he is in violation of God's duty. And so what these guys argue, very importantly, is that every king has not a divine right. There's no such thing as that for these Jesuits. There's no such thing as a divine right. There's only a divine duty. And that divine duty is to sacrifice oneself for one's people. So, King Arthur, perfect example, even though mythological, perfect example of a good king. Alfred the Great, the first English king, another great example of a perfect king. Jan Sobieski out of Poland, the one who takes down the Muslims in 1683, right? Perfect example of a good king. So all of these are examples of this. But what they're doing, and notice this, and this is something I don't think we often think about, the whole idea of a divine right of kings comes from an English thinker who's a Protestant named William Tyndale. Tyndale is the one who comes up with the divine right of kings. And he writes a book about it called The Conscience of a Christian Man. And so it's the Catholics, and it's ironic because we usually associate that idea with Catholics. It's exactly the opposite. The divine duty of a king is in response to a divine right of the king. And so here's where these guys get really radical, more so than Aquinas. Aquinas said that we can publicly disavow ourselves from a king, but he leaves it at that. He doesn't explain what we can do. What these three guys say is it's absolutely our duty every time as Christians to kill the king as soon as the king becomes something that is not kingly anymore. In other words, once the king is no longer sacrificing himself for his people, his life is forfeit. And so they're advocating what's called regicide, the murder of the king. And that's going to be very important for us in this class, because the one person who is deeply, deeply influenced by this, besides Charles Carroll, but the one person in a Protestant context who is taken in by this is a guy named Algernon Sidney. And Sidney writes a book, he's executed for it, but he writes a book called The Discourses. He is a hardcore Calvinist, deeply Calvinist. And so what he does is he takes the Catholic theory of these Jesuits and he Protestantizes it. He makes it palatable for Protestants. And remember, when Thomas Jefferson says, who are the four people who influenced the Declaration of Independence? He says Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney. So this is ironic. It's ironic that Jefferson will actually be using radical Jesuit arguments, but he's doing it through the intermediary of a Protestant, Algernon Sidney. Does that make sense for everyone? So this is what Charles Carroll is learning. So he's learning Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, and these radical Jesuits. So in 1762, not surprisingly, in 1762, this college is shut down by the Jesuit order for being radical even for the Jesuits, because they've been arguing in favor of killing kings. And then, maybe even more famously, in 1773, the entire Jesuit order is closed down by the Pope. They'll revive in around 1810, but for roughly 40 years, there are no Jesuits. No Jesuit order, at least. There are probably still Jesuits running around, but no Jesuit order, because again, of how radical they are. But notice what this means for someone like Carroll. Carroll is ultimately one of the two most educated of all the founding fathers. He and John Dickinson have the highest level of education, and Carroll actually has a bit higher than Dickinson. Carroll not only gets his BA at Saint-Omer, again in classical philosophy, but then he goes on to a French university and earns a master's degree, which was very rare in that day and age. He earns a master's degree in Platonism, in Platonic philosophy. And then he goes on and gets a degree in French civil law, and then he travels to London. He can't be at the main law school in London because he's Catholic, but he goes to Oxford, and there he studies law with Blackstone and gets a degree in common law. So he is without question our most educated founding father. And think about what that means then, what it's going to mean for the founding itself. He comes back to America in 1765. He's 27 when he comes back, 1765. His parents, very interestingly, had gone ahead and had declared him their son when he was 20. So once he reached age 20, his parents declared them his son. He was, for all intents and purposes, and I always love throwing out a cuss word every once in a while, but here this is actually accurate. He was a bastard until his 20th year. He comes in then and is made the heir to Charles Carroll. Notice what happens. He's no longer legally prohibited because he's not a child anymore at age 20. And his mom and his dad actually have a church wedding at that point when he turns 20, because they're not scared anymore of the laws against them. Nothing can happen in terms of retribution for their son. So in 1765, Charles comes back to America. And remember what's happening in 1765. It's the Stamp Act crisis. And even though Charles cannot serve in a law court or in politics, he very much uses what influence he has in terms of his friendships in private society to convince the Americans that they need to get rid of the Stamp Act. So right away, as soon as he gets back to America, he involves himself in these patriotic, anti-British affairs. But there's another thing I want to mention at this point, which I think is fascinating too about him. In 1757, when he's 20, and when he turns 20 in 1757, the Carrolls are invited by the French government to settle in Louisiana. Now, nobody knows they're going to lose it here in just a few years. France has a very solid control. And if you guys remember when we talked about the French and Indian War, 1757 was the high point of French victory in North America. They'll go down completely after that. But from 1754 to 1757, the French are dominating the British in that war. So the French come to the Carrolls and ask them to leave Maryland and to settle in Louisiana. We don't know exactly where. They were offered an immense tract of land. Basically, it would have been like a state that they would have been given within the Louisiana Territory. And it was somewhere on the Arkansas River. That's all we know. So my guess is, for what it's worth, it was probably somewhere in the present-day state of Arkansas. But it could have easily been in Kansas or Colorado, but chances aren't good because it's Great Plains. So I think it's probably Arkansas where they would have gone. And they had a serious debate about it. And there's all kinds of correspondence between Charles Carroll of Annapolis and Charles Carroll of Carrollton over what to do, whether to accept this invitation from the French. And ultimately, what Charles Carroll of Carrollton says is no matter how anti-Catholic Britain is, he would rather be under English laws which allow for civil freedom rather than under France, which doesn't allow civil freedom, but allow them to be Catholic. And so they ultimately decide to stay in Maryland. But I find that very fascinating that they make that decision. So they're hoping that they can overcome the anti-Catholicism at some point. Well, Carroll really, because of his money and because his family is so well connected, even though again he has no legal rights within Maryland, Carroll becomes involved in a number of disputes that are happening in Maryland and in the colonies overall. And the biggest one happens in 1773. And I mentioned this to you guys before your test, but if you don't remember it, it's fine, I'll go over it again. The great debate in Maryland revolved around two different things. So Maryland is torn asunder because it's got a legislature that's pretty pro-Maryland and a governor that's a royal governor and very pro-England. So Maryland is divided between being kind of pro-English and being pro-American at that point. And the two great debates in Maryland are this. Number one, is it legal for the executive branch to tax? So can the governor, even though he doesn't have the support of the legislature, can he put taxes on the people? And of course, this is in total violation of English common law to do this. Only a legislature where you're represented can be can create taxes. You can't do it through an executive or a king, a governor, anything. But Maryland's trying, and the governor there is trying because they need the money, and the legislature's not providing. But the second question is this. If it's mandatory that you have to be a member of the Church of England, that is, if you have to be an Anglican, can you use money for Maryland to pay the salaries of Protestant ministers? So in other words, does the government fund the church? Those are the two great questions. And one guy who had been a hero during the Stamp Act because he opposed the Stamp Act, was a Marylander by the name of Daniel Delaney. And Delaney's a pretty big deal in Maryland throughout all of the 1760s. And he's seen as a great patriot because he had fought against the Stamp Act in 1765. In fact, he wrote probably what was the best argument against the Stamp Act, and it was read throughout the colonies and in Britain and elsewhere. So he was very famous for this. But over the course of the 1760s, he became more and more pro-English, and he'll ultimately be a loyalist rather than a patriot. So he's moving dramatically in that direction. And he creates a debate in the newspapers called the First and Second Citizen Debates. And in it, he makes a mockery of the position that is basically that the government or the governor can't tax. He believes that the governor can tax, and that the government shouldn't be funding the church. He believes that the government should be funding the church. So notice he's changed his opinions, again, going from being a pretty serious American patriot on the way to being a loyalist. So the first citizen in the debate is a total idiot, and it's laid out that way. And the second citizen is this brilliant figure who just argues circles around first citizen. And so, what does Charles Carroll do? Charles Carroll, remember, no legal status at all because of his religion. He writes to the newspaper, the Maryland Gazette, which was one of the main newspapers in America. He writes to the newspaper and he says, by the way, I'm first citizen. And he gives this brilliant exposition about what the first citizen is. And it's all deeply, deeply Whiggish and Republican. And yet he's Catholic. So we've got to think about that and what that means, how he can balance those things. Delaney is shocked by this, and Delaney responds. But instead of calling himself second citizen in the response, he gives himself a name called Antolon. This is the name he gives himself. And I will tell you guys that I searched, because almost always whenever someone takes a pseudonym, it's always a classical reference, right? Always. I searched high and low, everywhere I could find in Greek and Roman history for anything named Antolon. And I got the classics department here to help me. And we were all searching everything we could to find Antolon. And then we realized it was not a classical name at all. Antolon is a scientific term. It's volcanic ash that has caught fire twice. That's what it is. Volcanic ash that has caught fire twice. And so very famously in American history, some of the most famous debates anywhere in American history, they are called the First Citizen Antolon debates. And each of them takes 4 sides. That is, they each write 4 articles in all of this. And Delaney is horrified because he knows that he's being argued with. Everybody knows who they are. No, this is not secret, even though they take these names. They all know that. Delaney's horrified that people are taking a Catholic seriously in all of this. Just horrified by it. And so he is writing all kinds of things. He's brilliant. Delaney's brilliant. Yeah, I disagree with everything he argues, but he's brilliant in what he does. But he keeps undermining himself because every time he makes a good argument, he says, and please remember, my opponent is a papist and therefore not a citizen. And it really undermines him because he had a good argument and then he has to make it personal at the end of that. And here's what Carroll does, and this is where I want the Catholics to get their due for a moment. Carroll comes back and he says, all right, let's talk about this. What does this mean that I'm not a citizen here? Well, first of all, I'm a Platonist, and I'm trained in philosophy, and I have a master's degree, and I have 2 law degrees. So I actually at least have something to say here. But most importantly, let's look at the history of Catholicism. Catholicism actually introduced equality into the world. Catholicism allowed for the Magna Carta, the greatest statement of freedom ever written, to be written. These were all Catholics who did that. And the whole idea of common law, even though it comes from the pagans, was always sanctified by the Catholics. So when you're talking about Protestant liberty, you have to remember you came to the table 1,500 years late. We've been there since Christ. You guys have only been there since 1521, 1517. Right? And that's his argument that he makes. And what's amazing is almost all of Maryland, almost the entire colony, sides with Carroll on this. They all side with it. And Delaney's reputation is almost completely destroyed. And I want to read to you, I think this is hilarious. I'm not going to read a lot. Carroll, whenever he wrote, and he was a beautiful writer, and you can imagine from all of his classical training, whenever he writes, he is always taking the high road. He's always quoting classical figures. He's quoting Montesquieu. He doesn't like Locke, actually, but he quotes almost anybody that you can imagine. And he's always got these great arguments. And one of the most important arguments Carroll makes, which has nothing to do with Catholicism, one of the most important arguments he makes is that the English Constitution is a Gothic Constitution. It's the language he uses. And what he means by that is that the English Constitution critically is not perfect, and its imperfections make it beautiful. In other words, being Gothic, it's not a system, it's a process. And it's an organic, natural process. And Carroll praises that. This is what we want in a constitution. We don't want perfection, because humans aren't perfect. We want our constitutions to reflect our fallen nature. We want them to strive for perfection, but never actually to attain it. We don't want that, because at that point, it becomes, he doesn't have a word for this yet, but the word that would be used later would be ideological. It becomes ideological at that point, and therefore destructive.
That was the way they described the Magna Carta as well, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. It's Gothic, right? It's jagged. So think about a Gothic cathedral, beautiful spire and then a gargoyle. And the gargoyle doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit, but there it is. And that's what he's getting at. That's what makes it beautiful. So it's not a machine at all. It's not ideological. It is a process, and it's an organic process. So just like common law. So that's the most important argument that he makes. But he can also be really funny. And I'm going to read to you just my favorite passage. It's not representative, but it's my favorite passage. And remember, through all of this, Delaney is personal. He keeps attacking him for being Catholic over and over again, which again just undermines his argument by doing that, but he does it. So in the final letter number 4, by First Citizen, by Carroll, he, not surprisingly, and I'll just give you a list here, you don't need to write this down, but he quotes Lord Bolingbroke, and then Coke, and then Hawkins, and then Blackstone, and Hume, and Swift, and John Dickinson, and Juvenal, Alexander Pope, Milton, and even quotes Delaney from 1765. So this is all part of the fourth. And then he says this. Now remember, he had almost always taken the high ground. This is the one time he doesn't, and it's hilarious. Why, Antolon, am I even suspected of bearing you malice personally? What should excite my envy? The splendor of your family, your riches, your talents? I envy none of these from you. In fact, what do I consider you? You strike me like a jewel buried in a dunghill, and I'm not quite sure which you are. So that's cussing in the 1700s, but it's hilarious, right? And it's the only time that he gets to him in any kind of personal way. But here's what happens, and this is just stunning. So here's Carroll, no legal rights at all. Maryland takes the 4 letters of Antolon, and they have a funeral for it. They have a huge parade. They have Delaney in effigy, and they have a copy of the 4 letters. They walk down Annapolis' city street, and then they hang it from a pole as if they're hanging a man. They hang the effigy and they hang the articles. And then they actually have a coffin, and they put the 4 articles in the coffin and they bury it. And who is now the most prominent figure in all of Maryland? Charles Carroll. He is now the leader of Maryland. And so when we get to 1774, it's Carroll that everybody turns to. And what's amazing, remember what we talked about with Maryland? All of those guys meet in convention. Remember their convention in Annapolis in the spring of 1774? That's all led by Carroll. Carroll creates his own government in competition with the legal government. And over 9 successive meetings, Carroll's government, the convention, is in charge. And so when Maryland sends delegates to the Second Continental Congress, they send Carroll. He's their representative. He's the signer of the Declaration. Do they ever get rid of the Catholic laws? No. They just ignore them. They're gone. The revolution overcomes them. They no longer have weight at that point. And that's the genius of the founding. Incredible to see that kind of prejudice that's just erased. Kendall.
Yeah, I was gonna ask if the funeral was that inspired by Guy Fawkes Day. Do you think?
Oh, I think all of that has a similar kind of component
Because
to
it's
it.
kind of
So,
ironic.
yeah.
That's an anti-Catholic
Right.
thing, and then
Right.
they're kind of converted in
Yeah.
a sense.
And by the way, I should say, Carroll did not participate in the burial. He thought it was kind of lower class.
Yeah.
So he read about it, but he wasn't a part of it because he didn't want to be part of the rabble. But they wanted him to be a part of it very much. So good. Who else up there? Yeah, Anna Kate.
I have 2 questions going back to just leading up to this. So first, we talked about Charles Carroll being part of the Rockingham policy as well as Cavern with John Dickinson and
Yes.
Burke and
They used to go get beer together.
yes. So
Yeah.
did he get connected to them at Oxford?
Yeah, so that was when he was at Oxford. That's when he used to meet with with Rockingham and Burke,
Okay.
and they would go to that tavern and drink. So he was a young man, really young man at that point. He would have been in his early 20s when that was going on. But yeah, and that's a high honor that he was brought in as an American to be able to do that with these guys. So, Kendall?
Just out of curiosity, do you know what tavern they meet in Oxford?
I think it's called Buckman's. I'd have to look it up. I do have it in my notes somewhere, but I don't remember, Kendall,
Was it
exactly what
Wildman's?
it's called. So, Nathaniel?
Wildman?
Was it Wildman's?
Yes.
It might
I think
be.
that's
I
what it
can't
is.
remember.
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah.
That's what you told us.
Anne?
I remember that was called Wild Man's, so. like
That's
Wildman's.
rad. That's probably it. Yeah.
So with the parade thing, was that basically just a public declaration of wow, that guy's really dumb and he lost?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, absolutely. They're rubbing it in Delaney's face.
Just the public
And-
way of being oh, someone lost.
Right, and what this also means is the governor cannot tax and the government cannot pay the church. Those sides lose because of Carroll, even though Carroll's not even really dealing with those. But the whole colony becomes Republican, small r, Republican at that point. Good. Anybody else have hand up? Anna Kate?
Yes, we might be coming back to this, but whenever you're talking about how Carroll was in the college that was against kings who were
Yeah.
tyrannical,
That's on there. Yeah.
yes, was that commonplace? I'm thinking of Samuel West's election day sermon of defending and saying that all biblical precedent is that we should overthrow kings that are tyrannical. So was that before Carroll? Was that already commonplace in America?
That's all coming through Sydney.
Okay.
Sydney is incredibly important in America, and it's actually, I'm sure you've met people named Sydney. That became the fad during the American Revolution to name your children Sydney. That's where that comes, and it's where Sydney, Australia comes from as well. So he was a really prominent Republican figure. Again, and he's a Calvinist, serious Calvinist, and he's murdered by the king. So that he's a martyr, everything. He's a great hero for Protestant America. Really great hero. Good. Okay, is that clear for everybody? All right, so here's what happens. Charles Carroll is elected to the Second Continental Congress, and he is then the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. but his story's not over here. I want to tell, we'll end a little bit early today, but I want to tell you a couple of other things that happened for him. So when Carroll signs the Declaration, and it's a big deal, right? There are only 56 signers. It's a really big deal that he signs that. All 56, right? They all matter. But when Carroll signs it, he says explicitly that the whole reason that he has signed it is because it inaugurates the age of religious freedom in the world. That's what he believes. And it makes sense, given his own background, that that's what he would be going for. So that's why he signs the Declaration. And everybody's pretty astounded by it. They all love Carroll. And it's funny when you read, for example, the best diary without question about the whole founding period is John Adams. And remember, John Adams is probably the most anti-Catholic American there is. And every time he talks about Carroll, it's always with awe, but then it always ends, oh, and let me remind you, he's a papist, right? It's always in his diary that he has that, but he's amazed. And when Carroll signs his name to the Declaration, remember he's the wealthiest man in America, a bunch of people, including George Washington, comment, there goes an entire fortune, right? It's gone. And here's what's amazing. Carroll almost single-handedly funds the army during the Revolution. He loses a third of his wealth because he is the one funding the U.S. Army. And he and Washington are the tightest allies. He's in Congress that whole time. And if you guys know, and we haven't talked about this yet, but Washington is loved, but he's also feared in the Continental Congress because they don't want a dictator, and they know that Washington could easily become that. And so often, when Washington makes decisions, Congress will double guess him, will second guess him, and try and stop him from doing certain things. And it's always Carroll who's able to convince Congress to go along with Washington. So not only does he fund our war, but he's Washington's closest ally in all of this as well. Here's another thing that's very interesting. I'll just tell you three more things about him. So he is also the author of the Maryland Constitution, and he specifically creates the Maryland Senate. And the Maryland Senate is meant to be a place where you are protected from being popularly elected. And you're popularly elected, but then you have multiple years to serve as a senator. It was meant to be a debating society, so a serious philosophical organization. And when we turn to Madison in Federalist 63, he says our whole Senate is based on Maryland's Senate. In other words, Charles Carroll is our architect for our U.S. Senate. And he is a senator as well. As soon as the Constitution goes into effect, he's a U.S. senator. So hugely important that he's the architect of the U.S. Senate. Okay, here's what happens to him. He doesn't like politics. He's done what he needs to do, and he just wants to maintain his family and his business. And his father, they were best friends. His father passes away in 1782, and so Carroll inherits this huge estate. He does serve in the Senate, and he does serve as a Federalist, trying to get the Constitution in place. He's a huge defender of the U.S. Constitution. But once that's done, he leaves politics, and he just goes into business. But notice how long he lives. He lives until age 95. And this is the second thing I want to talk about for him in terms of what I think is important with him. And that is, and this is amazing, he meets de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville comes and interviews him. And I have actually, this is one of the coolest things in my life, I have sat in the exact same chairs that de Tocqueville and Carroll sat in around a fireplace and talked. And in that conversation, he basically, because Carroll's the last of the founders, he talks about the nature of our republic. And it's a beautiful, in fact, almost everything de Tocqueville writes about in terms of what the republic is all deeply influenced by Carroll and Carroll's views of this. And this is what de Tocqueville says. Now remember, Carroll's in his 90s when he meets de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville says, He's totally fit, mentally and physically. In fact, when he meets with de Tocqueville, he had just ridden his horse 16 miles. In his 90s, he had just ridden his horse 16 miles. He was a tiny man, very, very thin, very small, very short, but in great health, and he was in great health all the way until he died in 1832. And here's the last thing I want to say about him, and we'll close it out for today. I love this when he dies, because he's the last, right? Only Madison remains, but Madison didn't sign the Declaration. So he is truly, and remember before that, you had Jefferson and Adams who died on July 4th of 1826. So this is 1832. And here's what happens. He dies on November 14th of 1832. Andrew Jackson is president. And right when he dies, word goes out across the country. And this is what I love. There are 2 headlines for all the newspapers in the country announcing Carroll's death. So it's a huge deal. This is the last of the founding, right? The last of the signers. And so one of the headlines was, the Israeli prophet has passed. And the other headline was, the last of the Romans has entered eternity. Now, just think about that. He has the weight of Isaiah, and he has the dignity of Cato the Younger. That's incredible to think about that. And of course, it's mythological. They're mythologizing him. But that's how they see this. The last of the Romans has passed into eternity. So it's just great. So anyways, that's my spiel on Charles Carroll. All right, Anna.
You have mentioned before that at their deathbed, all of the founders felt that they had lost the republic.
Yeah.
Already, did Carroll?
He was very worried about it. We have some speeches. He gives some speeches at not only at the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, but then at the opening of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, he gives a speech. And in that speech, he does worry that we have lost our virtue, but he now claims that the virtue of America will have to be taken up by the mechanics and the engineers rather than the farmers. And of course, he's giving it at the opening of this railroad, so it makes sense he's thinking in that way. But he's also pretty pessimistic about what happened. Really, it's only Madison who's optimistic about the future. So, good. All right, thanks, guys. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week.